The Task of Loving in Can You Forgive Her by Anthony Trollope. Within the first 4 chapters of the novel, the reader is introduced to most of the characters who will be in the Vavasor sections of the novel. And already by the 4th chapter, we are aware of the fact that there is a distinct lack of affection in this family. And perhaps it should come as no surprise when George Vavasor, the wild man, as he's termed in chapter 4, the title of the chapter, says to Alice, I don't find that task of loving so very easy. George is someone who is controlled by an inordinate sense of his own importance, a quite overriding sense of entitlement to whatever it is that he wants to achieve. He isn't idle, unlike some of the male characters in the novel, but he nonetheless thinks that things really should come to him very easily, simply because he's set his mind at undertaking them. He has been engaged to Alice due to an affair with a woman whom he ultimately abandons and leads to destitution. Alice breaks off their engagement. Following that, he becomes engaged to an heiress whom he likes, but whom he admits in chapter 4 to Alice he was never actually in love with. He says that he doesn't regret the loss of either her or her money. She dies. He is sad about her death, but he doesn't regret the loss of the relationship, and he doesn't either regret the loss of the money, he says. Nevertheless, when he becomes engaged to Alice again later, he is really in this totally motivated by self-interest. One is the restoration of his pride, in that he had previously lost Alice, and he feels that there's been some blow to his standing, his honour, his prowess as a man, that she left him. He has been resentful of the engagement with John Grey, as if John Grey were his enemy, whereas in reality he himself has caused the rupture in his relationship with Alice. There was no interference from John Grey that broke it up. Also, in engaging himself to Alice, who does not have a huge fortune, George Vavasor's mind is very much set on obtaining her money, which he goes about single-mindedly and most unattractively, most greedily, really with absolute avarice, even to the point of making Alice feel physically threatened. In order to gain his ambition of becoming a Member of Parliament, which he has previously tried to do and lost all the money that he himself has earned previously in positions that he held. George is the heir to Squire Vavasor in the north of England. And whether or not Squire Vavasor's character has had an influence that has descended down through his family, or whether it is as a result of the malaise that a society that's so built on rank and standing as pertaining to birth, the position of the primogeniture, is hard to say. There would have been those who shrugged their shoulders at all of this and just simply got on with living their lives and making the best of it and trying to make their way in life and to succeed as best they could without falling into the traps of idleness or disappointment or just simply thinking that other people owe them a living. George Vavasor would appear to, in many respects, fulfill the description of the psychosis narcissism. Narcissism does tend to be a popular word that is very casually used in today's media, mass media, whereas it is actually a psychological condition, it's a mental illness. It's very well described, as a point of fact, by Neville Symington in his book Narcissism, A New Theory, originally published in 1993, although I think brought out again in 2018. Neville Symington's book is interesting, especially in that he draws on Tolstoy's Anna Karenina to help illustrate the psychosis of narcissism. Anna Karenina was published in 1878, so it wasn't any influence on Can You Forgive Her by Trollope. Nevertheless, I do think that there are aspects of George Vavasor which conform to the narcissistic pattern, which involves this inflated sense of one's own importance, a need, an excessive need really for attention and admiration, in a sense, concurrence with everyone else, with that individual's ambitions, wants, likes, dislikes. It can result in quite troubled relationships because of the lack of sympathy for other people's needs or wants or desires or hopes. It often has an impact on people's capacity to deal with their financial affairs. They overspend in order to achieve the outward appearance of greater importance. There's often a great deal of unhappiness, disappointment, and the expectation that others will make this right, that they will grant favours, and offer help, which is not of a normal level for everyday social interaction. There is a form of narcissism which involves attack, in other words, violence, that when what is wanted isn't simply granted, the person suffering from narcissism launches violent attacks on others. And we see this in George Vavasor in his attitude towards Alice with regard to receiving funds from her. We see it as well at one point very, very vividly in his relationship with Kate, where he strikes her and causes her to break her arm as she falls. In the Vavasor family there is also John Vavasor, who has also an inflated sense of his own importance. He thinks that he should simply be given plenty of money to live on without having to do any work. We see as well Burgo Fitzgerald, who, because of his high birth, although he's not a first son, and because of his great beauty, seems to think that, again, he's owed a living by the world, that other people should succour him. Geoffrey Palliser makes relatively feeble attempts at trying to support himself independently in his own life. But again, he seems to think that others should be there to take care of him. These characters are not beset by the need for admiration, which John Vavasor exhibits, but they do, in their lack of sympathy, their lack of true ability to connect with others, John Vavasor especially unable to connect with his daughter Alice, they do exhibit some qualities of narcissism. It could be that because the patriarch of the family, Squire Vavasor, is quite a wild, quite a raw, quite a bellicose, rough and ready character, as might befit the descendant of a landowner from sort of ancient history who was able to take control of lands in the warlike region of the north of England. Especially at this period, this type of character still comes forward in fiction, but probably also existed in reality as well. Members of the aristocratic gentry class who are not particularly refined. They still very much in that character of the people who originally gained the lands that they hold. So whether Squire Vavasor's character is in part, the very cantankerous nature of his character would appear to be in part to do with his age, but it's so deeply ingrained in him that it would also seem that it's part of the nature of the person whom he's always been. And if this has been too great an intimidation for the psychology of young people growing up under his sort of family control, is difficult to say. But the Vavasor family are, to use a modern phrase, quite dysfunctional in their relationships with one another. In other videos, especially the one on Alice, Alice's emotional range has been discussed, and also discussed in terms of her relationship with her father, the fact that she lost her mother in infancy. Alice would appear to suffer from some of the characteristics which are common for people who have lived with narcissists. She has a pervasive tendency towards self-sabotage. This surely, in large part, underlies her rupture of the engagement with John Grey, which to all intents and purposes is good for her in her life. However we might quibble with the way in which life was set up for women at this period, for Alice this relationship is a good one, sound, solid and offering love, which Alice seems to find it very difficult to accept and to perhaps even understand. Alice as well is quite heavily beset by a sense of self-criticism, which is another characteristic that people who've lived with narcissism suffer from. Another typical psychological position is that people doubt their worth and doubt their own ability to love. And this is something that Alice doubts with regard to her relationship to John Grey. Emptiness, sadness, that's definitely present in Alice's life. Her cousin Kate Vavasor plays quite a key role in influencing Alice to engage herself again to George Vavasor. And this is a significant strand of the plot. Kate, in some ways, may be interpreted as a disloyal friend, someone who advises Alice in order to gain advantage for her brother. But I think we shouldn't forget that where violence manifests in a relationship, it probably is simply present in the relationship. It may not have been the first instance of violence that George has displayed towards Kate. We know that in extreme circumstances he is capable of being violent, as he attacked the robber in the house when they were growing up, which was in self-defence, but he is quite capable of strong violent action nonetheless. Kate, like Alice, displays many of these qualities of self-sabotage, self-criticism, doubt of her own self-worth, doubt of her ability to love, because she has set any idea of getting married aside. She is there to support George, to serve George. She considers that she's married in some ways to George. Her personality has been absolutely subsumed by George's narcissism. And in extreme cases, this is an entirely possible psychological situation. Now, whether or not all of the second sons, there's another video, the second son syndrome, whether they are all afflicted by narcissism or afflicted by circumstances or afflicted by plain idleness is highly debatable. At a slightly lower social level, Captain Belfield, who vies with Mr. Cheesacre for Mrs. Greenaw's attentions, displays, again, many of these same characteristics and qualities. He's been a pretty mediocre captain in the British Army. He is now decommissioned, and he has no desire to earn a living. He's reasonably good looking, although his looks are on the wane. He's quite dapper nonetheless. He's out simply to marry a rich wife. Now, is he narcissistic? Does he suffer from a lack of self-worth? Or is he just plain idle? And the same questions, of course, can all be asked of Geoffrey Palliser, John Vavasor, and Burgo Fitzgerald. George Vavasor is definitely not idle. He has worked hard, and he works hard in order to get into Parliament, but he doesn't succeed. And that disappointment, which is perhaps due to his inability to form good relationships, also good relationships with working colleagues, of which there is a history of him rupturing his relations with working colleagues as well, maybe one of the reasons why he just simply doesn't succeed in getting his seat in Parliament the second time. So he does get into Parliament, but at the point of re-election he doesn't get into Parliament. George's story escalates. I won't follow it through for the reader who hasn't read the novel, but it does escalate and moves into absolutely extreme levels of obsessive self-interest and self-importance. By strong contrast, John Gray, who to all intents and purposes is represented as the most conventional, the most moderate man who wishes to live a retired existence as an independent scholar, is, when it comes to love, the most tremendous risk-taker. He loves Alice deeply, and yet time and again he is prepared to go to Alice after she has rejected him and to speak kindly with her and to be understanding towards her and to simply request that she doesn't discount him altogether. It is the most remarkable depiction of emotional self-confidence, of emotional assurance. John Gray is in no way emotionally arrogant, I don't think. If he is realistic, that is difficult to say. In my experience, I don't think I've ever met anyone who could possibly meet these levels of emotional confidence. Although perhaps I'm mistaken, perhaps I haven't been able to read it, I cannot imagine it myself. And yet the psychology of the character of John Gray is seamlessly carried through. He is, as a character within the novel, entirely believable. I think that there's one point right at the end of the novel where the modern reader may find his behaviour slightly difficult, but I won't discuss that for the reader who hasn't read the novel. But it is very, very interesting the way in which Trollope depicts these two ends of the scale. Plantagenet Palliser as well, although in many respects from his rank and position and the fact that he's quite reasonably clever, he could probably walk into quite considerable roles in government relatively easily. Yet he works very, very hard in order to achieve his career in politics. Ultimately as well, he works very, very hard to bring his marriage into a range that allows both him and Glencora to lead happy lives. He is prepared to put the effort in. He doesn't always understand the effort that's required of him, but he's prepared to put the effort in. So in Palliser and in John Gray, we see really that the reverse of the spectrum, the opposite ends of the spectrum. Trollope is really in advance of his period in, I think, being able to identify these psychoses and to carry out such consistency within the psychology of his characters. Narcissism was not a concept that existed in 1864, 1865. Trollope's own history of growing up in his birth family was very harsh. He was often neglected by his family, forgotten about by his family, left to his own devices as a teenager in his vacations, just passed over. His mother seems to have completely forgotten that he was there at times, and his father seems to have been fairly incompetent. Trollope as well was severely beaten on a regular, not to say daily basis by his brother when they were at school together. It was just gratuitous beating, not as punishment, but very hard to describe as what exactly. It would seem to me that Trollope's brother was perhaps suffering as well from narcissism. That Trollope himself was able to grow up to be so well balanced, to establish a very happy marriage, to establish a home, to establish a family, to have run two extremely successful careers. It's remarkable against his treatment as a child and young person. His insight into other psychology is absolutely remarkable. Presumably his suffering enabled this to him, but for many people it would simply have destroyed their capacity to relate and to understand other people's emotions and psyches. The task of loving. I think it is one of the major themes in this novel. We see it across all three of the situations that the women are placed in: Alice Vavasor, Glencora, McCluskey Palliser, and Mrs. Greenough. How do you negotiate love in your life, or what do you settle for if perhaps you think it isn't available? For the men, perhaps the emotional life is less important. Although I think, perhaps funnily enough, although he's a scoundrel, that Captain Belfield does need to be loved. He's quite a sad character in some ways. Yeah, the task of loving.